job. This is obviously not normal.
This is New Day with Allison Camerata and John Berman.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It is Monday, December 24th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Allison and John are off on this Christmas Eve, so John Avalon and I are taking the reins.
Buckle up.
Buckle up because it is quite a Christmas Eve. As we enter into day 3 of the partial government shutdown, negotiations between the White House and Senate Democrats appear stalled, with both sides digging in over funding for President Trump's border wall. The Trump administration now warning the shutdown could last into the new year.
But the chaos before Christmas doesn't stop there. President Trump abruptly forcing out Defense Secretary James Mattis 2 months early after coverage of the general's bruising resignation letter rebuking the president's sudden decisions to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan. Now, CNN has learned that senior military officials are worried about the uncertainty the military upheaval is causing, and U.S. allies are anxious, and global markets remain jittery.
All of this news leading to alarming headlines on the front pages. Here's a look at just a few. A rogue presidency, the era of containing Trump, is over. For a Trump, a war every day waged increasingly alone. And this, after James Mattis resigned, Trump's America is slinking off the world stage. We have a lot to cover. Let's begin with CNN's Boris Sanchez, who's live at the White House. Boris, good morning.
Hey there. Good morning, Erica and John. President Trump's Christmas vacation has been delayed. He is here at the White House instead of sunny South Florida. Of course, Congress is not due back in the nation's capital until Thursday, so Washington, D.C. may be a bit quiet until then, except, of course, here at the White House and likely on Twitter as well. The partial government shutdown entering its 3rd day, with a source telling CNN that little progress was made over the weekend toward ending the impasse over President Trump's demand for border wall funding.
It's very possible that this shutdown will go beyond the 28th and into the new Congress.
The White House backing off of their request for $5 billion, but continuing to insist that funding for the wall be included in any agreement.
We moved off of the 5. We hope they move up from their 1.3.
It will never pass the Senate. Not today, not next week, not next year. So, Mr. President, President Trump, if you want to open the government, you must abandon the wall. Plain and simple.
A source says that after President Trump rejected a short-term bipartisan deal to keep the government open last week, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer countered by offering more money for border security. That offer also rebuffed. Vice President Pence later offering his own counteroffer that was dismissed by Schumer. President Trump turning to Twitter to insist that a wall is the only solution.
It really is in the president's hands to decide. He says it's an issue of border security. I think we know better. It's an issue of his own political insecurity. When the right-wingers start screaming at him, he just backs off and dissembles in front of us.
Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle trading jabs on the Sunday shows, with some conservative Republicans urging the president to stay the course, as others in the GOP struggled to defend the shutdown.
It's a spectacle, and candidly, it's juvenile.
We have an impulsive president. We know that, and it's completely taking away a focus from where it should be on a very, very strong economy.
Approximately 800,000 federal employees are impacted, including more than 420,000 who are working without pay during the shutdown, and another 380,000 who've been furloughed. Meantime, there is more turmoil in the Trump administration. The president abruptly pushing Defense Secretary James Mattis out of his position earlier than expected, replacing Mattis temporarily with his current deputy and former Boeing executive Patrick Shanahan. Sources tell CNN that the president only realized how critical Mattis's resignation letter was after announcing that he was retiring with distinction, and that he's grown increasingly angry watching lawmakers lament Mattis's departure and criticize the troop drawdown on the news. Now, sources indicate that the orders to withdraw some 2,600 troops from Syria have already been signed. That drawdown expected over the next few weeks. The big question now is whether the president will look to do something very similar in another hotbed of terrorist activity, Afghanistan. John, Erica.
All right, Boris, thank you. Let's bring in now senior editor for The Atlantic and CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein, senior political correspondent for The Washington Examiner and CNN political analyst David Drucker, and congressional reporter for The Washington Post and CNN political analyst Karun Jamerjian. Good to have all of you with us on this very quiet Christmas Eve morning. Ron, let's kick this off with you. The reality is we wouldn't even be here this morning if the president hadn't rejected the deal that was actually agreed to.
But agreed to not only this time, if the president had not rejected the deal last year when Democrats offered him his border wall funding in return for a solution for the Dreamers. And ultimately that was sunk because the White House then insisted on adding massive, largest cuts in legal immigration since the 1920s. Look, I think this entire fight is incredibly revealing of the Republican mindset after the election. You are talking about using a tactic that is historically very unpopular, shutting down the government, for advancing a goal that is in polling even more unpopular, building the wall. I mean, I have not seen a poll with more than 43% of the country supporting building the wall. The last CNN poll, only 38% supported it, and that number dropped to 33%. Only 33% of the country said they supported building the wall if the U.S. had to pay for it. And it was opposed overwhelmingly by all of the groups that powered the Democratic gains in the midterm, including young people, minorities, college-educated whites. Only 30% supported it if the U.S. had to pay for it. And I think all of this is a signal that really kind of crystallizes what has happened since November, which is that Republicans essentially have shrugged off the midterm and again remain politically just kind of monolithically focused on energizing, activating the base, even at the cost of antagonizing the broader electorate.
And Karun, you know, one of the fascinating things about this sort of art of the declining deal we're witnessing in the context of this shutdown is the president now insisting via tweet that the Democrats own the shutdown. When most of us watched a week or so ago when he accepted full blame in that Oval Office meeting. Let's take a listen.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck. I will take the mantle. I will be the one to shut it down.
So, Karun, is this just the case, the president hoping we don't remember what he said a week ago? Or can he credibly make that case to the American people?
Well, I mean, tape is a pesky thing, right? And the president really does like to pivot and shift and rewrite what happened, usually over Twitter, whenever he feels like things aren't quite going the way that he thinks is advantageous to him, which is, you know, that you can bluster about taking full responsibility for a shutdown when it hasn't happened yet. When it's happened, it becomes a little bit more difficult to actually say, oh, okay, this is all my fault. Anyways, we know the president does not like to be blamed really for anything. So this is now, you know, let's switch up the spinning. He was speaking extemporaneously when he was in that meeting with the leaders of Congress, and now he's seeing that this isn't going that well in terms of how it looks. And so he's trying to spin it hard that this is the Democrats at this point who are at fault. I mean, look, we're heading towards the end of the year. Yes, the lawmakers are going to be back to D.C. a few days before the end of the year, but the incentive really is not to conclude a deal at this point. The Democrats are going to be taking over in the new year. They have more leverage once they're actually in the majority. And at this point, nobody trusts each other in this negotiation anymore. And so if there's offers being made across the transom still, and more bad blood being brewed up, you're just going to see more of this finger pointing. And are we going to call it a Democrat shutdown or a Trump shutdown? Unclear. Also, as much as shutdowns are bad, this one isn't really rocking the country the same way that the 2013 one did. It's a quarter of the country that's being shut down. It's not the military. That matters in terms of how angry people are. And so there's kind of room to spin right now because people aren't paying quite as close attention, at least in my estimation, as they were a few years ago.
No, Karun, I think you're right. They're not, and it isn't as big. Doesn't mean it doesn't affect those 800,000 people, obviously.
Right.
But you're right. When we put it in context, it is a little bit different. David, there's also the issue of, for the president, in terms of digging in his heels, there's a campaign promise at stake here. And it's not just the building of the wall, but it's that the president repeatedly told us that Mexico would pay for that wall. Well, of course, we know from Mexican leaders, past and current, the presidents, that's not going to happen, despite their attempts at, I don't know, some interesting government math with the new trade deal. That's not going to happen.
Also, the president's incoming chief of staff admitting that's not going to happen.
So when we look at it from that respect, how much of that need to fulfill the campaign promise is pushing the president in this moment, and how much of it is just him sitting back and saying, I can do whatever I want, and I will sit here as long as I want?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a combination of all of that. I think the main thing to look at here when you talk about the president's campaign promises is not so much whether Mexico is going to pay for the wall or not. It's whether or not the president is being effective in overhauling U.S. immigration law and beefing up border security. I think voters that are a part of his base, I think the media personalities on the right that push him into positions that he responds to will live with U.S. taxpayers paying for the wall. They may not live for the president not following through on overhauling immigration law and actually beefing up border security. And I think the president's been his own worst enemy here because there's a certain way to get this done. He's been president for almost 2 years, and there's really been no major legislative push, regardless of what you think of the president's policies on immigration, to actually get this done in Congress when he had a Republican House and a Republican Senate. He's tried it at fleeting times, in fleeting ways, to try and get a few things done, but not made the push like he did on tax reform or even attempting to overhaul Obamacare. And why is he his own worst enemy? Because not only has he not given the legislative push that's required, nobody trusts him. Republicans don't trust him. And the way it works in the United States Congress is if there is no trust, you cannot get people to make tough political decisions on your behalf. You know, in the opening, you played that clip of Pat Toomey saying that we know this president's impulsive. What Pat Toomey is saying is we can't trust him. A few days ago, everybody voice voted in the U.S. Senate this $1.6 billion or so for border security that the president agreed to, that the president asked them to vote for. They're now all on the hook for a vote they would have rather not been on the hook for, and the president just changed his mind after they had gone ahead and done it. That's why Mitch McConnell, who is always at the center of every negotiation when he can be, has ceded all of this to Chuck Schumer and said, you go make a deal with that guy. Everybody come back to us when you actually have something. They don't trust him, and that's why the president's not getting anything done
That
here.
lack of trust among Republicans is why you had so few folks standing up to defend the president yesterday. And one really kind of harsh criticism came from one of the first folks who endorsed him among his rivals in the presidential campaign, Chris Christie. Let's take a listen.
I want to ask everybody who's out in the audience today, if they have a 72-year-old relative whose behavior they're attempting to... No, hold on. Whose behavior they're attempting to change. When people get older, let's get ready, because it's happening to me now. When people get older, they become more and more convinced of the fact that what they're doing is the right thing, and it becomes harder to convince them otherwise.
Oh, that brings it home for the holiday season. But Ron, seriously, one thing that come with age supposedly is wisdom, and that comes from perspective. So let's take a look at the history of shutdowns to date, because it's pretty revealing. You know, early on, you had a bunch during Reagan and Carter, but take a look at the last 25 years. It's really been quite rare, and especially with the 2 Clinton shutdowns and the 1 Obama shutdown, it's with divided government. Democratic presidents and Republicans in Congress. You've had 3 shutdowns to date, the first 2 being pretty short duration. This new one looks like it could last quite a long time. Is this going to get worse when we get divided government? Is this just an impulse the president has?
Well, first, I covered those Clinton and Obama shutdowns, and the shutdown has never been able to force the other side to do what the proponents of the shutdown want. It's just not a powerful enough lever. And while congressional Republicans may not trust the president, I think David is exactly right, they do enable him. And the fact that House Republicans, in their final act as a majority, snub their nose at the voters who just chastise them in the midterm election and whack them in the midterm election by voting for, the $5 billion that they knew had no chance in the Senate, a final act of kind of enabling Trump in exactly the kind of way that cost them, I think, the midterm, losing 40 seats with 4% unemployment, was just really striking. And though there are a few voices like Bob Corker saying that this is kind of absurd, there have actually been very few, although they may not be defending it, Republicans who have kind of called out the unlikelihood of success here. And again, all of this behind a cause that roughly 40% of the country supports, building the wall, something that has been very popular with the Republican base, but is really deeply unpopular with all of the groups that powered the result in the midterm. And I think, again, it is just striking to me and indicative of how committed Republicans are to this strategy, this Trump strategy of doubling down on the base.
And Karin, what's remarkable, too, is if we just step back for a moment, I mean, this is, as my 12-year-old would say, you had one job.
You had one job.
But this is, if we look back at the job of Congress, too, I mean, you got to fund the government. And the fact that we keep getting to this place again and again and again, and we're here, yes, there's some finger pointing. Yes, the president is involved. But at the end of the day, we're still dealing with a Congress that hasn't gotten their job done, Karin.
Yeah, we are. Although in their defense a little bit, they've gotten a little more of their job done this time than they usually do. They did pass parts of the budget, which is why we're not in a full government shutdown as we have been in the past. But this just, I mean, that is just the status quo right now for Congress, is that you can never get full resolution. You can usually at this point agree on national security items and keeping those funded. But when it comes to domestic programs, it's really hard. And right now, what's adding to that is that you've got discord within the Republican Party about what they actually want. The dirty secret about the wall is that the whole GOP is not behind that plan. If left to their own devices, they would come up with some other kind of border security that would not necessarily be punching this mantra of wall over and over again. So you're not necessarily heading into a situation with the divided Congress that is going to be easier to pass these sorts of budgets. No. And with Trump in the middle, making deals that switch right and left every 24 hours sometimes, it's not a really good prognosis for how this is going to go.
And David, quickly, as you talk to folks on the Hill, is there anyone offering a constructive compromise that can get us out of this? Or is this still, as it was said a week or so ago, Jesus take the wheel, there is no plan?
Look, I think that there are, well, probably ultimately that's where we're headed. And I think this is going to go into the new year because there's just no incentive to fix this. There are some compromises being thrown about. I think at the end of the day, it's what is the president going to agree to? And I think one important thing to understand here, and Ron touched on it, is that while the president is playing to his base and the base is committed to him and the wall, there's the larger Republican electorate, the traditional Republican electorate, and we saw what they thought of the president in the midterm elections. And what the president is in danger of running afoul of here is the coalition that actually placed him in the presidency, because he needs both. And right now he's only playing to one. He's only got one. And I think what Republicans on the Hill are trying to figure out post-election, and especially with the Mattis news, is whether or not the juice is worth the squeeze, because they've always said about him, the behavior's one thing, but everything he's doing is right. So we'll make that bargain. And is that now a bargain worth keeping? And we'll find out over the next few weeks and months.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Merry Christmas Eve.
You too.
Merry Christmas.
Thanks, guys. President Trump forcing out his defense secretary 2 months early after sudden decisions to pull U.S. troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. Ahead, the growing uncertainty for the U.S. military and the concern that's causing. Uncertainty and concern in the wake of big changes for the U.S. military. CNN has learned senior military leaders are worried about what's to come after President Trump forced out Defense Secretary James Mattis next week. The order to pull troops out of Syria is signed, while plans to get about half of the U.S. military stationed in Afghanistan out of that country are being worked on. According to the Wall Street Journal, one Marine commander told a group he was speaking to, quote, "I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen." Sobering words. Joining me now, CNN national security analyst James Clapper, of course, the former director of national intelligence and a retired lieutenant general with the U.S. Air Force. Director Clapper, always good to have you join us as you look at what's happened, even just since the last time you spoke on this topic. Mattis being forced out now as of January 1. What does that do? What is your main concern there in terms of a transition?
Well, just exactly that. I mean, Jim, in his very thoughtful resignation letter, had thought about that and was trying to be at least disruptive under the circumstances as possible. So now that his distinguished time as Secretary of Defense, and which was a retirement, according to the president, now is turned into a firing, and that's not surprising that the president would do that after realizing that the letter was actually a pretty scathing indictment, and seeing the reaction to it, that he would want to try to take charge and fire him as opposed to letting him retire, air quotes. So the big thing is just the disruption.
The disruption. As we reported, CNN's own reporting, senior military leaders very concerned. They're worried about what comes next because so much is unknown at this point. There's also the reality of how a troop withdrawal works. And the fact that the concern here is that perhaps the president doesn't fully understand how complicated this is. And while there may be a number of Americans who support the move to pull troops back, just doing it on a whim could be dangerous.
Exactly. I spent 13 years throughout my career in the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is an institution of planning and orderliness. And deploying troops and withdrawing them is not, they are not trivial undertakings. And there are all kinds of implications here when you withdraw, particularly doing it as we appear to be doing in Syria so precipitously. And there are all kinds of unintended consequences that are going to occur here, and this plays havoc in the Pentagon. And the other thing I think, of course, is they're all kind of on pins and needles over there, wondering, well, what's next? What's the next tweet we're going to get about either deploying or withdrawing with not a lot of notice?
As we look at all of this play out, too, it's hard to forget what we've heard from the president in the past, specifically in terms of his own knowledge about how things work and what's happening. I just want to play a little bit of that sound for you.
I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me.
Do you still feel like you know more about ISIS than the generals?
Well, they don't know much because they're not winning. That I can tell you.
When you hear those comments played for you again, what comes to mind?
Well, just appalling arrogance and, his portraying himself as a stable genius and all that sort of thing. These things are really complicated, and he would do well to listen to his advisors. And I would point out, by the way, that ISIS is not defeated, not in Syria. And by the way, it's a good thing to remember that ISIS is other places besides Syria, like Afghanistan, where they have a pretty prominent presence there as well. And so I don't think he knows more than the generals do.
There is a lot on the president's plate at this moment, as we know. But if we take a look at who is in place to help him and to help with the everyday job of running the government, it is striking as we look at how many positions have not only had a number of turnovers, but also positions that remain unfilled and what folks coming into those positions will have to deal with. This is an extensive list, and we're 2 years in. Is this something that you feel is in any way starting to take shape? I mean, there are normal moves within an administration, but to look at this point 2 years in, it makes you wonder what comes in the next 2 years.
Yes, exactly. We may look back in 2019 longing for the relative calm of 2018, because I think there's going to be a lot more of this. I do think that Jim Mattis's resignation and the manner in which he did it was a really significant milestone, because I think it's going to cause a lot of other people to do some hard thinking about their own position in the government and whether they can continue to serve. And I think it's also going to be difficult to find others who are qualified, who can be confirmed, to come to the government and serve.
Do you think, to that point, do you think people will start to become more vocal? I mean, to this point, yes, some people who have left a little bit, of course, what we heard from Rex Tillerson last week. But otherwise, even when we're just looking at lawmakers in terms of Republicans, it's folks who are retiring who were the most vocal and who seem to be unafraid of calling out the president when they believe that something was a bad idea. So do you think that will change, too, among lawmakers?
Well, it could. I mean, again, I think the response by many Republicans to Jim Mattis's resignation is perhaps indicative of perhaps newfound boldness to speak up. And I hope, by the way, that Jim doesn't dance quietly off stage, that he will continue to be an influential voice even as he leaves the department.
A lot of folks anxious to hear from him directly beyond that letter, understandably. Director Clapper, always good to see you. Thank you. Happy holidays.
And the same, Erica.
Appreciate it. Get a check now of CNN Business this morning. Wall Street is bracing for more volatility after the Dow suffered its worst week since the 2008 financial crisis. And all of this comes as Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin called top executives at U.S. banks over the holiday weekend to reassure investors. CNN chief business correspondent Christine Romans joins us now with more. It may have had the opposite effect.
I don't think it reassured anybody. People last night trying to figure out what in the world he was talking about. So he spent Sunday calling bank CEOs from his vacation in Mexico in a bid to reassure investors after the worst week since the financial crisis. First, the damage report here. This is what we're coming off of here. The Dow last week fell almost 7%, worst weekly drop since October 08. The S&P 500 lost 7% last week, worst week since August 2011. NASDAQ, 8.4% on the week, the worst week since November 08. And the NASDAQ is officially in a bear market. Now, Mnuchin's attempt at damage control didn't really inspire confidence. I mean, after his calls to the 6 bank CEOs, the Treasury issued this statement, quote, the CEOs confirmed that they have ample liquidity available for lending to consumer business markets and all other market operations. The financial world spent the day puzzled about what he meant. There is no doubt, there's no question that banks have ample liquidity. So why did he inject that? Then he added this: we continue to see strong economic growth in the U.S. economy with robust activity from consumers and business. Again, no question, the U.S. economy has had a great year. But yes, it has been a terrible few months for stock investors. Still, no one's forecasting a financial crisis. A financial crisis is what he's talking about. Far from it. All 3 major market averages are down more than 12% in December. They are on pace for the worst December since the Great Depression. So that's clearly at the forefront here. The markets are acting as if a recession is right around the corner, which is why the selling might be overdone. The blockbuster growth of 2018 likely to fade. Risks like the escalation of the trade war with China, they still loom. Still, market veterans tell us that panicky Wall Street is prematurely pricing in a recession that may not hit until 2020. Now, then there's this. The messaging from the White House is not helping this. The president's attacks on the Fed chief raising big concerns. A source said President Trump has been asking advisors if he has the legal authority to fire the Fed chief, Jerome Powell. He picked him. Remember, he picked him. This weekend, the Secretary Mnuchin said he never suggested the president can fire Powell. The president said that. And Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney said the president realizes he can't fire Powell. But even talking about firing Powell is just so bad for the markets. The president has often attacked him for raising interest rates, blames him for the market plunge. Interest rates have gone up 7 times since Trump took office for just this year.
So, Christy, what was the Treasury Secretary thinking? Because he presumably should know better.
I don't know. It sounds like it was a check-in call with these banks just to say, you know, it was a really terrible week on Wall Street. The banks are like, yeah, everything's fine. You know, everything's fine. It was just a bad week on Wall Street. But at the forefront, when you see these comparisons to the financial crisis, that must be a real burr under the saddle of the administration. Every time you say since the financial crisis, since the Depression, they don't like that.
And really quickly, how often do those calls normally happen?
They happen from time to time. I mean, the Treasury Secretary is in contact with the bank chiefs. But this made it sound like it was some extraordinary
circumstance. I'm calling to make sure.
And specifically about the ample liquidity. I'm telling you, the smartest minds in money all day yesterday were like, why did he say that? No one thought there was a problem with liquidity. Why inject it into the debate? As one Democratic senator said, it's like being in the health department saying, don't worry, your water's not poisoned. I heard someone say it's like saying to your spouse, don't worry, honey, I'm not cheating on you. You know what? Why would you even bring that up?
These are not best practices.
No. Did not inspire confidence.
All right.
Thank you.
Up next, CNN learns the president is complaining about a federal case he's named in with his acting attorney general. Will his venting create more legal problems for the president? Sources tell CNN President Trump is angered by federal prosecutors and venting to his acting attorney general, Matt Whitaker, at least twice in the last few weeks. They say the president is frustrated because those prosecutors reference the president's actions in crimes his former attorney, Michael Cohen, pled guilty to. Now, while the acting AG oversees those prosecutors, sources say Trump has not directed Whitaker to stop the investigators. So let's bring in former federal prosecutor and CNN legal analyst Ellie Honig and former FBI senior intelligence advisor Phil Mudd. Gentlemen, good morning. Ellie, let's start with you because this news, amid the big news we've got, hasn't got a lot of attention, but a lot of conservatives, for example, were furious that Loretta Lynch met with Bill Clinton. How does this compare with that?
This is a huge deal, and I think it's been underplayed a bit. Look, this is worse. Think about it. You have the President of the United States telling the acting Attorney General, keep the Southern District off my back, right? When Loretta Lynch, Bill Clinton, I think there were problems with that, but Bill Clinton at the time was the spouse of a candidate. He had no say or even indirect say over what Loretta Lynch did. And I think the president's message to Whitaker was quite clear, right, which is, I'm furious that the Southern District named me in connection with the campaign finance. And saying that is really no different. When your boss tells you, I'm furious that X happened, it's the same thing as saying, don't let X happen again. And it gets back to the president's sort of fundamental misunderstanding about the Department of Justice. The U.S. Department of Justice does not exist to serve Donald J. Trump, the individual, or even the president of the United States. The Department of Justice serves the American people and justice. This is what got him in trouble in the first place, right? The meeting with Comey where he said, hey, go easy, lay off on Flynn. This is no different than that.
Could this connote obstruction?
I think it's one and the same. I think it's the exact same idea. You know, the bar for obstruction of justice is really quite low. I don't know if people fully understand that. I've prosecuted obstruction of justice cases for an individual trying to get a witness to change one element of their story. Here you have somebody in power saying, get these guys away from me. So I don't see an argument against it being obstruction.
Which is fascinating. Phil, as you look at this, and I think it's interesting, too, that as you point out, Ellie, Bill Clinton meeting with Loretta Lynch, well, you know, couldn't really have any influence. A lot of people would take issue with that and say, well, actually, we think there could have been influence. If nothing else, though, the optics of that were bad. It's tough to argue a counterpoint on that one. Even just from an optics perspective, Phil, even if someone is in fully agreement with Ellie that this could be obstruction of justice, it doesn't look good for the president.
Yeah, but I think he's playing checkers. He's not playing chess. Let's look at the optics of this. From the outside, on the surface, you'd say, wow, the acting attorney general is in the office with the president, must feel some pressure to intervene in the case. Well, let's take that one step forward and move out of checkers into chess. Let's say that before, last week, Whitaker thought he would pick up the phone and talk to the Southern District of New York just because he reviewed some of the elements of the case and said, I have a perspective I want to talk about. The president almost limited Whitaker's ability to interfere in the case now because regardless of the facts of the case, if Whitaker says something now, what are the optics going to look like? Well, you did that because the president teed you up in the Oval Office. I think the president vented thinking maybe he could pressure Whitaker. I think quite the opposite. Now he almost ties Whitaker's hands because Whitaker can't do anything without appearing to acting at the behest of the president's orders.
Unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Ellie, let me speak to you about one fascinating case, the so-called mystery Mueller case. There is a company that seems to be under seal indictment that is fighting handing over some records, and Justice Roberts weighed in over the weekend to issue a stay, so they didn't have to. What do we know about this case, and why is it drawing so much speculation and attention?
So this is the mystery case, the mystery subpoena case, where there was all these sealed arguments happening in the D.C. federal courts. On Friday, we learned that the recipient of the subpoena was not an individual. Some were speculating maybe it's the president, maybe it's the vice president. Turns out it's a corporation that is in some part owned by a foreign state. Right, and so there's plenty of speculation about what that could be.
Who could fall into that category?
Yeah, I mean, look, the most likely category would be a foreign-owned and foreign-backed bank. We know the president has a long relationship with Deutsche Bank. I'm speculating, but if making a sort of reasonably educated guess, he's taken hundreds of millions of dollars in loans from them. They were recently raided. So if I had to guess, that would be my guess, but it would only be a guess. What we do know also is this company really, really does not want to turn over this information. It's fairly rare for a corporation to fight a subpoena like this. Usually if you're a corporation, you receive a subpoena, you may argue to limit it in some respect, but to just say, no way, we want nothing to do with this. We're going to fight you in the district court, then we're going to fight you in the appeals court. They lost both of those, and then we're going to take it to the Supreme Court.
It makes you wonder what it is that they don't want to reveal. It really does.
It does.
Phil, I want to get your take on this. We heard from Adam Schiff over the weekend. Obviously, as everyone is waiting to know what Mueller has learned, there is some question about whether we will ever know. Adam Schiff tackling that. Take a listen.
I'm prepared to make sure we do everything possible so that the public has the advantage of as much of the information as it can. Now, there may be parts of the report that have to be redacted because they involve classified information or they involve grand jury material. This case is just too important to keep from the American people what it's really about.
Phil, you think he's putting the cart before the horse here. Why?
Yeah, slow down here. Look, we have enough news in this town without worrying about what might happen a month down the road, 6 months down the road. It's appropriate to look at what Mueller is doing and say we ought to at least privately be concerned about whether this case will continue or whether somebody, including the incoming Attorney General, will try to shut it down. But we don't even have a Mueller report yet. The case isn't even shut down yet. Can we deal with what we have now and try to stay cool in the midst of a crisis? One thing you learn in government, the hotter it gets in the kitchen, the cooler the cook gets. Let's not deal with what might happen. Let's just deal with today. That's what I'd argue.
Phil Mudd, Ellie Honing, good to see you both. Thank you. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg recovering from cancer.